Hi, folks. Yeah, I was just spending time with God and speaking about if I was having a conversation with Archie, the pastor of the Vineyard Church. Yeah. Well, and if I asked him that question, really, about the videos I've done about the church. If I asked Archie, did you go to God and ask him if God wanted me to do those videos about the church? Obviously, the answer would be no. Well, because again, if God says yes, right? If God says yes, what does he do? That's the thing, isn't it? And yeah. And I'll have to say to him, I'm sorry, but the reality is, in all things, you don't go to God. I'm not sure if in most things you actually bother to go to God. You go to people, yes. You check things with the leadership. You check things with your wife, obviously, because she's one of the leaders of the church. But you don't check things with God. And yet, you believe that God has given you this church and God has given you the authority over the people who come to this church. Well, neither of those things is true. God never gave you this church. The Vineyard Church or organization gave you this church. And the authority? You have none. Because the reality is, he has none. Neither does his wife, neither do any other people. They only have the authority that the people themselves give or allow them to have. And, interestingly, the people do allow them to have authority and they shouldn't. Anyone who doesn't go to God, doesn't take things to God, I would ask the question, do any of the leaders do that? Do any of the leaders of the Community Church of Vic Harris, do they do that? Do any of the leaders of the River Church, do they do that? Do they take things to God? No. No. No, because again, if their will is to do a certain thing and they take it to God and the answer is no, or they understand they're going against God's will, then they're a little bit stuck. And they can't be stuck. Well, the River Church and the Community Church of Vic Harris, they ban people. Right? Whereas I've spoken about the Vineyard Church, I'm probably banned from that one now as well. Certainly unless I promise not to do videos. And actually, unless I promise not to talk about the bad things they do. The good thing is I can do videos about them. They would be quite happy with that. It's only the bad things that they'd be unhappy with. So, yeah. None of these people, none of the leaders of these churches will go to God. None of them really could care less about God. Being the leader of a church is the same as being the leader of any organisation. What used to be the community centres used to have leaders. They were the people that would decide what happens and where money that's given to the centre goes to. And church leaders are basically that. That's what they are now. They couldn't care less about God. That's why, come on. If the Vineyard Church was doing right, when they were invited to be involved in the 4th of July thing, they would have checked with God, right? They should have, yes, of course, because if you're going to involve your church with other churches, you want to know whether these other churches represent the same values that you do. Represent, and again, those values should be what? The will and ways of God. Right? Yeah. Again, all of that is just... it just comes across as very unfortunate. And yeah, I suppose in the end, the reality is, as I've said before, and this is what it has to rest upon all the time, people make their choices. And if people are choosing... But again, I knew I was going to leave that church. I would have gone on Sunday because I said to one of the ladies who does this tea thing that I've got a number of jars that I could take and give to her. Because one of the things I asked for last Sunday was for jars. And I thought, I've got some, so I said I'd take them. I also said to another couple who have got a wedding anniversary coming, I have a bottle of fizz that I won't be using. Champagne sort of stuff, and they can have it. And so I would have gone and taken that. And I would have gone on Tuesday just to say to the group, I won't be returning, and this is why. And that would have been it. I would have been out. I wouldn't have been going back to the church. So the reality is, if other people are happy with the standard and with what's being done in that church, again, they can read the Bible. They can see that the worship is not according to John 4. I think it's verse 23. They can see that. But if they're okay with the fact that the church isn't even trying to do that, or is not apologetic in any way, shape, or form for not doing that, but the church is instead saying, this is how God wants us to worship, this is fantastic. But if people are okay with that, if people are saying that's good enough for me, then okay. You choose to align yourself with something that's most obviously not God, has no desire to be God. Well, because again, how long? If you are a church that has a desire to do the will and ways of God, how long? How long are you going to keep doing things the opposite of the will and ways of God? How long are you going to keep doing that? Because obviously they've been doing worship in that church the way they do it now. Because, if as a church they were worshipping the Father in spirit and in truth, until Matthew came along, until Jessica and others came along to lead the worship and take it a completely different direction, they would have stopped those people from doing that, wouldn't they? But they didn't. So therefore, how long until you say, right, okay, maybe the first thing we do in church has to be done right. maybe the first thing we do when people come in, the first thing we do as a church, which is worship, has to be done according to God. If we want to be doing things according to the will and ways of God, that has to be done right. How long until you think it's suitable to decide that maybe you should be doing that? I mean, I am very much of the impression that if you're serious about doing things according to God, it shouldn't take too long. Should it? Not really. The only reason it takes long, and the only reason it hasn't happened yet, is because you don't care. You don't care that worship is how it is. You actually like it how it is. How it is actually how you want it to be. So the fact it's not according to the will and ways of God, you like it that way. So, yeah. In the end, that's obvious. And to anyone else in that church, that should be obvious. If they use the brain that God has given them, it isn't difficult to see that. Of course, if I spoke to Archie, to Jude, or to Richard, or other people involved in the leadership, they would say, well, no. We're learning as we go. And because we were starting a church and we didn't have enough people, we had to just, do what we could with what we had. Well, I'm sorry, no, that's bullshit. That would be bullshit if they said that. You had to do what? You had to worship the Son instead of the Father. No, you didn't have to do that. And okay, if you had to do it at the start, when you didn't have worship leaders, then okay. But you're perfectly happy with worship leaders leading the worship in a most, at least, minimum, false worship. How do I know it's false? Because if the Lord said true worship is worshipping the Father, then false worship is worshipping anything other. Again, false is nice. Demonic is also true. That the worship they do, the worship church does, not just a vineyard, not just the churches in Elgin, but church. The established church is demonic. Because it is. If you're worshipping anything other than that which the Son of God says you should be worshipping, then, again, whatever is making you worship the other thing is a God that you're putting over God. And so, therefore, it ain't God. If it ain't God, then it must be the other one. So, but again, if that's what people are choosing, not just in that church, but in all the other churches, then okay, enjoy. You have one life. That's what you're choosing for it? Okay. Yeah, okay. You're not my concern because you're choosing it. So actually, from now on, if I go into a church, as soon as I see that people are accepting that as good enough, and they tell me that the worship was fantastic, and they're worshipping anything other than Father, then I have to say, right, I wish you well, but I will not be remaining in your church. I will not be returning to your church. Because you told me you're being led by something that is not God. And that something is the God of this world. So, you're not my brother, you're not my sister. So there you go. You take care. God bless. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.